In some sectors, it's significant, particularly in cellular telephones, but everywhere else, it's minuscule. And I'm not surprised, because the private sector can take risks up to a certain limit, and they need returns, sizable returns. Infrastructure is a high-risk business, and therefore they need high returns. So it is very unlikely that the infrastructure gap in Africa is going to be filled by the private sector. I don't think it will happen. We've been waiting for it to happen for 30 years. We will wait another 30 years before the gap is filled. Public sector has to come in and fill the gaps that cannot be filled by the private sector. Before I go to your question, I want to respond to some of the points that have been raised. Now, the World Bank says that there is over $90 billion. There's a gap of over $90 billion in investment in infrastructure. There has been very little infrastructure investment in most of Africa for the past 30 years. There was infrastructure investment in the initial period of colonization, and it's very interesting that you are refurbishing the railway system that was built by the Brits before the Prime Minister was born. And then in the initial years of independence. Since 1980s, the gap in infrastructure investment has gone in the wrong direction. Why? Because since the 1980s, the policy has been the private sector does the infrastructure. Now, why do we need infrastructure? What's the point? We need infrastructure primarily because that's an essential input for manufacturing, for exploiting our natural resources, for agriculture, and so on and so forth. Now, in manufacturing, public sector doesn't have much of a say. In agriculture, the public sector does not have much of a say. In mining, same thing. So enabling the private sector through public investment in infrastructure is not something that Africa is going to discover. If it tries to, it will simply be reinventing the wheel. That's what happened everywhere else. Second point I want to make. When I say much of infrastructure investment in Africa, not all, but much, will have to be public, that doesn't exclude, for example, in the case of a railway, implementation of the project will probably be done by some multinational company. The wagons and locomotives will naturally be manufactured by somebody else, another private sector. The management of the railway system itself might be done by a private company. But the ownership and the risk capital of that railway system, if it comes from the private sector, it will have a number of risks. First, all of you are saying the public sector has to de-risk. In other words, you are saying the public sector shoulders the risks and the private sector reaps the benefits. That's not going to work. Second, your discount rate is understandably high. You want to have a profit rate of what? 20%? The average profit rate in Africa that people expect is about 30%. With a discount rate of 30%, imagine how much infrastructure we will be able to do and how much of the gap we are going to fill. So the idea should not be that the public sector should be out, private sector should be in. We have to do, each one of us have to do what our comparative advantage seems to suggest. Now, the public sector does not have money. And that is limiting investment in infrastructure. But you know, these whiz kids in the financial system, I'm sure they can create instruments. The Prime Minister created one instrument. It's called the IFF. The idea was that he would commit to pay a certain amount of money for, say, 30 years for development aid. And the banks would use that as collateral and give us the money now. Simple idea. Financial engineering. Same type of financial engineering can be made. Chiam has a big multinational financial institution. This talk about deleveraging and all the rest, there's trillions of dollars of money that does not know what to do. And because it does not know what to do, it's going from one commodity to another commodity and becoming a wrecking ball. Today it's oil, tomorrow it's wheat, the day after tomorrow it's some other paper. We want this capital here to do something tangible. And there's a risk here. And the risk, Don's institution is AAA rated. Mine is junk. So if Don could raise the money and lend it to me, then I'll have the money to invest. And the private sector can come in implementation, can come in manufacturing, and so on and so forth. Now, two issues you raised, telecommunications and finance. We have not liberalized the financial sector in the sense that we have not allowed foreign banks to operate in Ethiopia. Why? Because these giants, Chiam, manage an economy that's many times bigger than mine. These giants can wreck a giant economy such as that of the United Kingdom. Ours is a flimsy boat. They come in, they use instruments that we cannot control, that in most instances we don't even understand. The best of us don't even understand. How are we going to regulate it? How are we going to regulate these people? It's not possible. We don't have the capacity now. So what did we do? We allow the private sector in Ethiopia, which is not that, not infinitely more complex than the public sector, and therefore could easily be monitored and regulated by the public sector. We allow the private banks to operate here, so we have more than 10 private banks here, but not foreign banks. Is this going to be the permanent feature? No. As we grow, as we develop, and as we become more sophisticated in our regulatory capacity, of course we'll liberalize, but not now. And we have lost nothing because of this policy. Telecommunications. Ethiopia, as a country, I think in per capita terms, is investing more in infrastructure than perhaps any other country in Africa, whether it's railways or power or telecommunication. We're doing it by borrowing from banks that are not that good at speculation, mostly Chinese banks. So we have the money, borrowing it, and we want telecommunication in every school, in every village, and we want it cheap, not at 30% discount rate, at 2%, 3% discount rate. That is why we have not yet opened up the telecommunication sector to private investment. Is that going to be the permanent future? No. Once the market failure there is overcome, we move out. There were times when we owned breweries in this country. Now we are privatizing all of our breweries because that's not our business. The private sector can do it excellent and can do an excellent job. We used to own, and we still own some textiles. The only textile factories we own are the ones that we could not privatize because they're not making profit. But we want to privatize this. So it's not, our policy is not designed to keep the private sector at bay. We know that's a dead end. Without the private sector, there is no development. What our policy is based on is make sure that the public sector plays its role so that we will have Asia-type growth. What do I mean by Asia-type growth? Fast, but not just fast, equitable. Both fast and equitable growth. You cannot have fast and equitable growth without a clear division of labor and partnership between the private sector and the public sector.
የለመንን ገንዘብም ቴክኖሎጂም ሰው እዚያ አድርሰን አሁን ቴክኖሎጂው ከተዘረጋ ነገሩ ከተወጠነ በኋላ በገንዘብ ጦት መቀጠል ተሳነን። እያንዳንዱ መድፍ እንዲህ በቀላሉ የሚታዘዝና የምንተኩሰው ስላልሆነ ለመተኮስ የሚወሰነው ከአብዮታዊ ጠቅላይ መምሪያ ከኔ ነው። በቁሳቁስ እጥረት እና ይሄ ወደ ለየለት ሽንፈት እንዳያመራ በአስቸኳይ ይሄንን ነገር መወጣት አለብን። ይቻላል።
ብዙ ሰው ይሄንን ቦታ ይመኛል። ሚሊዮን ይመኛው ግን መሆን የሚችለው ምንም ሆነ ምን አንድ ሰው ብቻ ነው። እና እባካችሁን ከዚህ እንውጣ። በቆሎና እህል በሚገባ አምርተን ማንበላ ሰዎች ለፖለቲካ ስልጣን መንጠላጠል እንዴት እንደቀደም ከእንግዲህ ወዲያ ይሄንን ህዝብ በየጊዜው ና እንደዚህ ሆኖልሃል ና እንደዚህ ሆኗል እያልን መርዶ አርጂ መሆን አንችልም። ጓዶች ሰውም ሊሚት አለው። ስለዚህ ቀላል ነገር አይደለም የምናወራው። በቃል እንደሚደረገው በተግባር ነገር ግን ቀላል ነው። ህዝቡ ከተሰለ እንደ እውነት የሆነ ዋግ ብቻ ይበቃው ነበር ወይም ወሎ ብቻ። ምንድነው ወሎ ውስጥ ብናየው? ተናገሩ ከወሎ የመጣችሁ ጓዶች። እኛ የምንፈልገው ኢሳፓን ነው፣ እኛ የምንፈልገው የደርግ ወታደር ነው እየተባለ አይደለም እንዴ በከበሮም የመጣውን ወያኔ የሚያሳልፉት? ይሄ ነው ያደራጀነው ህዝብ፣ ይሄ ነው ያነቃነው ህዝብ። ይሄንን ገበና መሸፈን የለብንም። ኢሳፓ ከየት የመጣ ነው? በዚህ ህዝብ ደምና በዚህ ህዝብ
I'll repeat what I said earlier on. Why do we need infrastructure? It's for economic growth and transformation. Infrastructure that does not serve that purpose is meaningless. Now, let me repeat again, I'm not saying the private sector has no role in telecommunications. Owning a cellular phone franchise in Africa is like owning the mint. So why wouldn't the private sector engage there? I have no problem with that. It's possible. I'm not saying that the private sector should not be engaged in any infrastructure activities. I am saying the infrastructure activities that matter for manufacturing is electricity. Roads, railways, ports. Without manufacturing, you do not transform our economy. So you can have all the best telecommunication in the world. If you can't manufacture a proper shirt to export, you can talk all you want on the phone, you will not transform your economy. So the key is agriculture and the key is manufacturing. On the issues that matter for manufacturing, for example, electricity, while the Nigerians have done a spectacular work on telecommunications, they have not done an equally spectacular job on power, electricity. And even if the private sector were to engage in generation of electricity, and it does, what will be the cost? They have to have their discount rate is steep. They have to have their profits. And who is going to pay for that? It's the manufacturing factory. So which one do I want to support more? The private sector that generates electricity or the private sector that uses the electricity? For me, supporting the private sector that uses electricity is more important for transformation than allowing the private sector to generate electricity. And my good friends, Chairman Don, have said that we are impatient. Yes, we are impatient. We are impatient because we are in a deep hole. And every minute in that deep hole hurts. Not psychologically, physically, people die. People die of hunger. So we need to move fast. Now, with regards to the factors that have helped Africa move, governments have changed, there have been elections, policies, macro policies, and so on and so forth. That is all true, but to be honest, that's old stuff. It was done in the 80s and 90s. So there's nothing new here. We are maintaining the same thing. We still have our conflicts. We still have our problems in governance. We have moved more aggressively to come up with a common African agenda and to engage the international community with one voice, and that has been a very important factor. And there is this big change globally. The tremendous growth in Asia has been the biggest savior of Africa. And we shouldn't ignore that. Now, if we don't take care, we'll be taken for a ride and dropped when the time comes. If we don't use this window of opportunity to transform our economies, then we'll be lost. And we have to learn from the experience of others. Most of the successful Asian countries, most of the infrastructure investment was not done by the private sector. It was done by the public sector. So let us not dichotomize. Let us, each one of us, do what we are best able to do. I forgot your question, sorry.
I think heads of state are allowed to forget questions. Is that, you're allowed.
You're getting old.
The problem is I also forgot my question. So we're...
The person wants a straight answer. I think Prime Minister Brown has given one side of that straight answer. I'll give you the other side.
So technically there are two straight answers.
We'll dividing, there is a division of labor. This is, he's the Prime Minister of the UK, so he has a European perspective. My view is that there is no direct relationship between growth, economic growth, and democracy, historically or theoretically. But my view is that democracy is a good thing in and of itself, irrespective of its impact on economic growth. And my view is that in Africa, most of our countries are extremely diverse. That may be the only possibility, the only option of keeping relationships within nations sane. Democracy may be the only viable option for keeping these diverse nations together. So we need to democratize, but not in order to grow. We need to democratize in order to survive as united, sane nations. That's my view. But I don't believe in this bedtime stories of and contrived arguments linking economic growth with democracy. There is no basis for it in history, and in my view, no basis for it in economics, and there is no need to do it. There is no need to have this contrived argument, because the case for democracy can stand and shine on its own. 2 points. Is the public sector crowding out the private sector investment in infrastructure investment in Africa? We're talking about $90 billion gap per year of lack of investment. When there is such a huge gap of investment in infrastructure in Africa, how is it possible to imagine crowding out of the private sector? For me, it doesn't appear to be logical. If the public sector was investing tons of money and crowding out the private sector, perhaps. But across the continent, the public sector is not investing in infrastructure. They don't have the money. African Infrastructure Bank, that was an idea that Don had raised many times. Last time we met under the chairmanship of Gordon Brown during the crisis, we wanted to get money under NEPAD for Africa. People were telling us there is no money. We are in crisis, there is no money. His staff gave us some information. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm releasing some information. That's
straight talking.
But other people knew it. They told us the IMF has tons of gold. It is valued at ridiculous prices. If you were to bring the price of gold a little bit higher, you would have a lot of money available, new money available for investment in Africa. So we use this insider information, and the maximum we got was $6 billion from the IMF, just from revaluing the gold. We could do something similar, but at a higher level, and that could be the capital injection that African Development Bank needs. It's AAA rated. If it gets $1 from the IMF, it can borrow $4 from the market, and it can lend to us at concessional rates. And that would cover some of our shortfalls. Thank you. Just wanted to reinforce what the representative of the railway system in South Africa, I understand, which happens to be public, I understand, just said. And ESCOM is also public enterprise. Now, if the thing we take from this panel is that there are two polar opposites, then we will have missed a golden opportunity. If the thing we take from here is that both the private sector and the public sector have a role to play in infrastructure, and the ultimate purpose of infrastructure investment must be economic transformation. If that's the message we take, then I think it's worthwhile. In some instances, in some countries, in Africa, for example, the border between the private sector and the public sector, which is a host and which is a parasite, is very difficult to differentiate. And dichotomizing this and saying the public sector is efficient and the private sector is parasitic would be wrong. And making the other conclusion, the public sector is always inefficient and the private sector is always efficient, is a myth that has wreaked havoc in this continent.
I agree.
It's a myth, and it's a very dangerous myth. So both sectors have a role to play, and it's a precise definition of their roles that is central to our future. Thank you.